There is a particular kind of silence that only shows up when a habit finally breaks. Not the silence of a fight, not the silence of a slammed door, the silence of a thing that used to happen automatically, at the exact same minute, every single year, simply not happening anymore. I want to tell you about the year I let that silence speak for me, because for 22 years I had been doing the talking, and nobody in my family had been listening. I didn't scream. I didn't send a single angry text. I didn't even tell anyone what I'd decided. I just let 7 o'clock come and go on the first Sunday of December, the way it always had. Except this time, there was nothing behind it. No transfer. No confirmation email. No quiet, invisible gift dressed up as somebody else's generosity. And it turned out that silence was louder than anything I could have said with my own mouth. But to understand why that one small, unremarkable moment mattered so much, you have to go back. Not to that December. Back further. To a version of me who still believed that love and money were the same language, and that if I just kept speaking it fluently enough, someday, someone would finally answer back in kind. My name is Adelaide Renner. Everyone who's ever mattered to me calls me Addy. I was 42 years old that first December, living in a narrow 2-story house on Talmadge Street in Duluth, Minnesota, the kind of house where the radiators clank like they're clearing their throats before they'll agree to warm anything up. I worked as the cafeteria manager at Lincoln Park Middle School, a job I'd had for 11 years by then, which meant I knew the difference between a kid who forgot their lunch money and a kid who was hungry because nobody at home had thought to check, and I quietly kept a coffee can behind the register for the second kind. My husband, Walt, had passed 3 winters before that. Heart, sudden, no warning, gone before the ambulance made it past the second stoplight on Superior Street. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you because it matters to what came later. After Walt died, the money that used to be ours became, in some unspoken way, entirely mine to decide about. And the thing about deciding alone is that you can talk yourself into almost anything if you're lonely enough and it looks enough like love. I had one son. Nathaniel, Nate, to everyone but the tax forms, was 20 years old that December, newly married to a bright, ambitious girl named Colleen, and just starting to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. I loved him in that fierce, uncomplicated way you love the person who used to fall asleep on your chest. I would have driven through a blizzard for him. For a long time. That's more or less exactly what I did, except the blizzard was financial, and it lasted over 2 decades. My days back then had a shape to them, small and steady, like a stitch pattern I could do with my eyes closed. Up at 5:30. Feed Pepper, my orange tabby, who'd wandered into my garage one October and simply decided to stay. Walk 2 blocks to a diner called the Aurora Line for a coffee before my shift, where a waitress named Fran knew my order well enough to start pouring before I sat down. Work the cafeteria line until 2. Tend a stubborn little vegetable garden in the side yard that mostly grew tomatoes and my own patience. Balance my checkbook every night at exactly 7 o'clock, because Walt used to do it then, and after he was gone, keeping his hour felt like keeping a small, private appointment with him. The Aurora Line closed at 9, and most nights I was long gone by 7. But Fran used to save me the last of the coconut cream pie on Fridays anyway, wrapped in foil with my name written on it in grease pencil, because she said a woman who spent her whole day feeding other people's children deserved to have somebody remember her order without being asked. I mention Fran because she is, in a strange way, part of this story too. She was the only person outside my own house who noticed, over the years, when I started coming in a little more tired around the holidays, a little thinner in the wallet, and never once asked why. She just poured the coffee a little fuller. It was during one of those 7 o'clock sessions, that first December, that I set up an automatic transfer. Nate and Colleen were struggling, newly married, thin paychecks, a landlord who raised the rent twice in 1 year, and I didn't want Christmas to be one more thing they had to grieve not having. So I scheduled it, the first Sunday of every December, 7 o'clock in the evening, a transfer to cover their Christmas. Gifts for whatever children might come along. A ham, a tree, stockings. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It was not a one-time thing. It became the architecture of 22 Decembers. The first few years, there was gratitude. Actual gratitude. Colleen would call, voice a little thick, and say something like, "Addy, you didn't have to do that." And I would say what I always said, which was, I wanted to. And I did want to. That part was true for a long, long time. But wanting to give is a different thing from being seen giving. And somewhere in the accumulation of years, I stopped being seen at all. The first crack came at a Thanksgiving when Nate was 29. His restaurant, a little sandwich shop called the Copper Kettle he'd sunk 3 years of his life into, was 9 months from folding, though none of us said that word out loud yet. His father-in-law, a retired contractor named Roger who talked like he was always closing a deal, made an offhand comment at the table about real investors backing his own son's startup, not just, family charity. Nate laughed along. Not at me exactly, just near me, in a way that let the air of it land on me anyway. I passed the cranberry sauce and didn't say anything. I told myself he was embarrassed about needing help, not embarrassed of me, and that those were different things, and mostly I still believe that. But it stung enough that I remember exactly which dish I was holding when it happened, and I remember driving home that night with the radio off, going over the sentence in my head, trying to find an angle where it didn't mean what I was afraid it meant. I want to pause here and say something about why I kept absorbing these moments instead of naming them out loud as they happened. It wasn't only about Nate. It was about a version of myself I'd built carefully after Walt died. A woman who didn't need anything, who gave without keeping score, who could be counted on precisely because she never made herself inconvenient. I had decided, somewhere in my grief, that being needed was a kind of company, and that if I ever let myself be difficult about it, the giving might stop being welcome at all, and then I'd have nothing. That belief cost me more than any single check I ever wrote. The second one came 2 Christmases later, after I had, quietly, without telling a single soul, not even Colleen, paid off the remainder of Nate's business loan on the Copper Kettle when it finally did fold in 2014. $6,140, wired directly to the credit union so his credit wouldn't take the hit. He never knew it came from me. He told everyone at that Christmas dinner that he'd worked out a deal with the bank, proud, a little puffed up with the story of his own resourcefulness, and I sat there with my hands around a mug of cider and let him have it. Let him have the whole story. Because I understood, even then, that some gifts only work if the person receiving them never has to know the weight of what was lifted off them. But it meant that when the conversation turned, as it eventually did, to "must be nice," some people just get to write checks and not think twice. Directed at me by Colleen's sister Marisol over the green bean casserole, I had nowhere to put the truth. I just smiled and said the beans were good. That night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were drying on the rack, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of decaf going cold in front of me, and I let myself, just for a few minutes, feel the full weight of what I'd carried silently that whole evening. The $6,140, the story Nate got to tell about his own resourcefulness. Marisol's comment landing like she'd aimed for a stranger and hit me instead. Then I washed the mug, dried it, put it back in the cupboard, and went to bed. I didn't yet understand that I was building a pattern of my own. The pattern of feeling something all the way through, alone, and then folding it up small enough to fit back inside an ordinary evening. The third moment I remember with painful clarity, because it was the first time it happened in front of my grandchildren. Nate and Colleen's daughter, Juniper, was 7 that year, and their son, a serious little boy named Desmond, was 5. It was a birthday party, Desmond's, at a rented party space with a bounce house and a taco bar, paid for, as most things were by then, through my 7 o'clock habit, though nobody called it that out loud anymore. I was setting out juice boxes when I heard Nate telling another father, a man I didn't know. "Yeah, Mom likes to feel useful. It's her whole thing. Not cruel, exactly. Almost fond, the way you talk about a dog that fetched slippers nobody asked for. But it recategorized 20 years of sacrifice into a personality quirk, a hobby, something I did for myself rather than for him." I finished setting out the juice boxes. I did not correct him. I remember Desmond running past just then in a paper birthday crown, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that I would rather he grow up believing I simply enjoyed being useful than grow up understanding exactly what useful had cost me, because a 5-year-old shouldn't have to carry that math. I told myself that was generosity. Looking back, I think it was also a little bit of fear. Fear that if the truth ever got spoken plainly in front of the children, something between Nate and me would break in a way it couldn't be mended. The fourth moment was smaller than the others, and somehow it hurt the most, because by then I think some part of me had started keeping score without admitting it. It was a family photo, the big one, The one that goes out on the holiday card every year. 12 of us crowded onto Nate and Colleen's porch steps in matching red sweaters that I had, of course, bought. The photographer arranged everyone. "Grandma, why don't you scoot to the end there?" she said, not unkindly, just practically, because I was the shortest and the oldest, and it made the composition work. I ended up half out of frame, one shoulder cropped off in the final print. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked for a reprint. I found out later Colleen had actually laughed about it, gently, to her sister. Addy's always trying to disappear anyway. As though my own quietness were the reason I'd been standing at the edge of a photograph someone else arranged. I kept that card on my refrigerator all year, the way I kept every year's card. Half of me cropped out, and I would catch myself looking at it sometimes while I did the dishes, trying to decide whether it bothered me because of the photograph itself or because of what the photograph had come to represent. A family that had gotten so used to my presence funding the edges of everything that they'd stopped noticing whether I was actually standing inside the frame or not. I want to be honest with you. None of these moments, on their own, would have broken anything. I've turned each of them over in my hands 100 times since, in the years afterward, checking whether I was being too sensitive, whether I was manufacturing a grievance out of ordinary family friction, the kind every family has. But it's the accumulation that does the damage, not any single stone. You can carry one stone for miles. It's the 20th one that finally puts you on your knees. The break came the December I turned 63, at a Christmas dinner Nate and Colleen hosted in the house they'd bought. With, though nobody said it plainly, a down payment that had also come from me, 3 years prior, filtered through a story about a great rate they got. I had made my 7 o'clock transfer as usual that first Sunday, for $1,200, covering the tree, the gifts for both grandchildren, the ham, the wine, the whole production. I arrived at 6 that evening in a green cardigan Walt used to say made me look like a Christmas card, carrying a dish of scalloped potatoes because showing up empty-handed, even after funding everything else, never once occurred to me. Dinner went fine, mostly. Then, over dessert, Nate stood up with his wine glass, the way he does when he's about to make an announcement, and said he and Colleen had decided to reallocate the gift budget this year to put toward a family ski trip to Lutsen in February, a trip that, notably, did not include me. "We figured everybody's got enough stuff," he said, smiling around the table. "Experiences over things, right? Mom's always been generous. We just want to put it somewhere it actually matters this time. Somewhere it actually matters." As though the 22 years before that hadn't. I said, quietly, that I would have liked to have been asked before the money I sent was redirected somewhere I wasn't invited. Nate laughed, not a cruel laugh, but a dismissive one. The kind that assumes the other person is joking even when they very clearly are not. "Mom, it's a ski trip. You don't even like the cold." "That's not the point," I said. "Then what is the point?" "The point is I would have liked to be part of the decision. That's all." "It's not that deep, Mom." "It is to me." "Well, maybe that's the problem," he said, and I watched something in his face flicker toward real irritation now, the kind that comes out sideways when a person feels caught rather than accused. "Maybe you make everything about being appreciated instead of just, I don't know, letting it be a gift." I didn't answer fast enough. Colleen's sister Marisol filled the silence instead, not even looking up from her plate. "The point is Addy likes being thanked more than she likes actually giving. Let's be honest." The table went quiet in that particular way that means everyone heard it and nobody's going to say anything about it. And then my granddaughter, Juniper, 11 that year, sharp as a tack, sitting 2 seats down from me with cranberry sauce on her chin, looked up from her plate and asked the question that ended up doing more damage to the room than anything an adult had said all night. "Grandma," she said, "is money the only reason we invite you?" Nobody answered her. Nobody could. I looked at my granddaughter's face, genuinely curious, not cruel, a child simply repeating back the emotional logic she'd absorbed from every adult around that table for years, and something in me went very, very still. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, though I felt the pressure of it behind my eyes, hot and immediate. I did not list the $6,140 or the down payment, or the 22 Decembers, though God knows every figure was sitting right there behind my teeth, ready. I set down my fork. I told Juniper, gently, that no, that wasn't the reason. that I loved being her grandmother more than almost anything in my whole life, and that it was a good and brave question to ask, and she should never be afraid to ask it again of anyone. I meant every word of that. Then I stood up, thanked Colleen for hosting, told Nate the ham was excellent, and drove home through a light snow with both hands steady on the wheel. Nate's reaction, by contrast, was loud. He called twice that night, left a voicemail that started apologetic and ended irritated. "I don't even know what I did wrong, Mom. You can't just leave like that and not explain yourself," as though my silence were the offense, rather than whatever had built it. Colleen texted the next morning, a long paragraph about how everyone's just stressed this time of year, which is the kind of sentence that explains a great deal about a family's habits by what it declines to say. I didn't respond to any of it that week. Not out of spite. I genuinely didn't have the words yet, and I have never trusted words I reached for too quickly in anger. On the third night, Nate texted, "You're really not going to answer me?" And I sat looking at that message for a long time, Pepper's tail flicking against my forearm, and I thought about all the times over the years I'd answered immediately. Answered the phone on the first ring, answered the emergency wire within the hour, answered every unspoken expectation before it had even finished forming into a request. I typed out 3 different replies and deleted all of them. What I finally sent, 2 days later, was short. "I need some time to think. I'm not angry. I just need quiet." It was the truest sentence I'd said to my son in years, and it was also the first time in a very long while that I'd put my own needs ahead of his comfort. Here is the thing. I want you to understand restraint, because I've thought about it more in the years since than almost anything else. Quiet is not the same as weak, and calm is not the same as passive. I sat in my kitchen that week, Pepper curled against my hip on the bench seat, and I thought, really thought, turned it over from every angle, about what it would mean to keep doing what I'd always done. To let the 7 o'clock transfer go through again next December, the same as the 21 before it, and to keep hoping that eventually the weight of it would be seen. I decided that hope wasn't a plan. It was just a longer, quieter kind of waiting for something that wasn't coming on its own. So I made a decision instead. A small one, procedurally. Enormous, in every other sense. I opened my banking app, found the recurring transfer I'd set up the month after Walt died, and I canceled it. I didn't tell Nate. I didn't tell Colleen. I didn't tell anyone. I let 7 o'clock, the first Sunday of the following December, come and pass in complete silence, the way any ordinary evening does when nothing in particular is scheduled to happen in it. Here's what I hadn't planned on. Canceling that transfer didn't just stop money from moving. It made 22 years of it suddenly visible, all at once, in a way it had never been visible while it was simply happening on schedule, like weather. Because the truth is, I hadn't just been sending money into a void. I'd been keeping records. Every 7 o'clock session at my kitchen table, dating back to the year Walt died, I'd written a line in a ledger. A genuine, physical ledger, green cover, the kind you can still buy at the office supply store on Central Avenue, noting the date, the amount, and what it was for. I'd done it out of habit more than intention, the same reflex that made me balance a checkbook when banking apps did the arithmetic for you automatically. But over 22 years, that habit had produced something I hadn't fully reckoned with until I sat down that January with a cup of tea and finally read the whole thing front to back. It wasn't just Christmas money. There, in my own handwriting, was the $6,140 for the Copper Kettle's final loan payment in 2014. There was the down payment assistance for the house on Larkspur Court, $11,000, dated the spring Nate and Colleen bought it, categorized simply as NNC, house. There were braces for Juniper, a used minivan the year Desmond was born, 3 separate emergency wires when Nate's second business venture, a landscaping company, hit rough patches he'd described to everyone else as temporary cash flow issues he'd handled himself. Beneath every entry, small and neat, I'd written thank you notes I drafted but never sent. Not because I wanted credit, I realized, rereading them, but because some quiet, hopeful part of me had always been practicing the version of the conversation where somebody finally asked how I'd managed it all. Nobody ever had that. I found something else in that same drawer, tucked beneath the ledger, that surprised even me. A folder of correspondence with a financial planner named Priscilla Odom I'd been working with, quietly, for 9 years, ever since a modest life insurance payout from Walt's passing had given me a small nest egg I refused to touch for anything but the family. Priscilla's notes showed that even while I was funding Christmases and down payments and secret loan payoffs, I'd also been investing carefully, conservatively, disciplined about it in a way none of my family knew, because none of them had ever asked what I did with my own money once the giving was done. I wasn't wealthy. I want to be clear about that. I was, and remain, a retired cafeteria manager on a modest pension. But I was careful. I had been careful for 2 decades, in total privacy, and that carefulness had quietly built something real underneath all the giving, something none of them had ever once bothered to ask about. There was one more thing in that folder that I hadn't expected, and it undid me more than the ledger itself. Tucked behind Priscilla's most recent statement was a stack of thank you notes, real ones, addressed and stamped, that I had apparently written every single December for 22 years and never once mailed. I don't fully remember writing all of them. I think I must have drafted them in those quiet minutes after the transfer went through, some private ritual of imagining the conversation I wished we'd have, and then folded the feeling away along with the paper before I ever worked up the nerve to actually send it. Reading my own handwriting from a decade earlier, Nate, I hope this makes the holidays a little easier. I don't need you to say anything about it. I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Sitting at that same kitchen table was like being handed a letter from a woman I recognized completely and barely knew at the same time. I sat at my kitchen table with that ledger and that folder in front of me, and I understood, finally, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I had spent 22 years being generous and 11 years being invisible, and that those 2 facts were connected in a way I hadn't let myself see before. It was Priscilla, actually, who suggested what came next, not out of any strategy to punish anyone, but because she was helping me update my estate plan that January. Given the amount I'd quietly accumulated and the fact that, at 63, I finally needed to think seriously about how it would be distributed someday. She recommended I meet with an elder law attorney to formalize a few things, and she referred me to a woman named Diane Kessler, whose office sat above a bakery on Superior Street I'd walked past 1,000 times without ever going in. Diane was somewhere in her 50s, sharp-eyed, unhurried in the specific way people are when they've stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. She reviewed my ledger, my transfer records, my investment statements, all of it, over the course of 2 long appointments, and she didn't react with pity or outrage, just steady, professional attention, the kind that made me feel, for the first time in a long while, like a person whose facts mattered rather than a person whose feelings needed managing. "You've documented this meticulously," she told me, tapping the green ledger. "Most people in your position have nothing but a vague sense that they've been taken for granted. You have 22 years of dates and figures. That's not nothing, Mrs. Renner. That's clarity." I told her I wasn't looking to sue anybody, wasn't looking for revenge, wasn't even entirely sure what I was looking for. "Then let's figure out what you actually want," she said. "Not what would hurt them. What would be true and fair and yours to decide." I sat with that question for most of a week before I came back to her office with an answer. It would have been easy, honestly, to let it become about consequences, to let Diane draft something with teeth in it, a formal accounting, a demand for repayment, a lever I could pull if I ever needed one. Part of me, the tired part, the part that had smiled through the green bean casserole comment and the cropped photograph and 11 years of small erasures, wanted exactly that. But when I actually pictured Nate reading a document like that, cold and legal and aimed at him, I understood it wouldn't give me what I was actually after. It would just replace one kind of silence, the silence of being unseen, with another kind, the silence of a relationship that had gone formal and armored and never came back from it. That wasn't the outcome I wanted, however satisfying it might have felt for an afternoon. What I decided I wanted, in the end, was simple, and it had nothing to do with lawsuits. I wanted my son to understand, plainly and without a fight, exactly what had been given, and I wanted the choice about what happened going forward to finally, for the first time in 2 decades, belong entirely to me. Diane helped me draft something not adversarial, a clear written summary of the ledger, formatted plainly, dates and amounts and purposes, the same document she'd have prepared for any client updating a family trust. No accusations in it. No editorializing. Just the truth, laid out the way only an outside, disinterested professional can lay it out, without heat, without a raised voice, without anyone in the room needing to defend themselves before the facts had even finished being spoken. I asked Nate and Colleen to come by my house on a Saturday in late January, and I asked Diane to be there too, not as an attorney representing anyone against anyone, but simply as the person who could speak to what the documents actually showed, plainly, the way a doctor reads an X-ray rather than argues about how it feels to have broken a bone. Nate arrived defensive before he'd even taken his coat off. I could see it in his shoulders, that particular bracing posture he'd had since he was a teenager expecting to be scolded. Colleen sat beside him, quiet, watchful. Diane laid the summary on my kitchen table, the same table where I'd balanced a checkbook every night at 7 o'clock for over 2 decades, and walked through it without drama. The copper kettle payoff, the down payment, the braces, the minivan, the landscaping company's 3 emergency wires. 22 Decembers of Christmas funding, itemized by year. Nate went very quiet reading it. Then he looked up at me. "You paid off the kettle," he said. Not a question. A fact landing. "Yes," I said. "I told everyone I worked it out with the bank." "I know," I said. "I'll let you tell it that way. I thought it mattered more to you that people believed you'd handled it yourself than it mattered to me that anyone knew it was me." He put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet, and his voice had lost every bit of its earlier edge. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because I didn't want to be thanked," I said. "I wanted to be seen. Those aren't the same thing, and I don't think I understood the difference myself until I was 63 years old sitting at this table." He didn't argue. That surprised me most of all. He sat with it. Really sat with it. The way you sit with something too heavy to immediately stand back up from. And then he said something that wasn't an excuse, though I understood, hearing it, that it was at least an honest explanation. "I think I made myself the guy who figured it out on his own," he said slowly, "because the alternative was being the guy whose mother had to keep saving him. And that felt worse than lying about it. I know that's not fair to you. I know it's not fair to Juniper and Desmond either, honestly, because I taught them the same story without meaning to." "That's not an excuse," I said. "I know," he said. "It's just what's true." Colleen reached over and took his hand, and I watched something pass between them that looked less like defensiveness and more like 2 people recognizing, together, a pattern they hadn't had the language for before that afternoon. Diane stayed quiet through most of that exchange, which I came to understand later was exactly the point of having her there. She wasn't there to referee or to prosecute. She was there so that neither Nate nor I had to carry the burden of narrating the facts while also managing the feelings in the room. The facts could simply sit on the table, plain and unarguable, while the 2 of us dealt only with what the facts meant to us. Near the end, she did say one thing, gently, directed more at Nate than at me. "For what it's worth," she said, closing her folder, "in 20 years of doing this work, I don't see many families with documentation like your mother's. Most people just have hurt feelings and no way to prove any of it happened the way they remember. She gave you a gift twice over, and I don't think either of them was really about the money." Nate nodded slowly, and I saw him look at me. Really look, the way you look at someone when you've just understood something about them you should have understood years ago. I want to tell you it was resolved in that one conversation, tied off neat as a bow, but that isn't how any of this actually works, and I'd rather tell you the truth than the tidy version. The first few weeks after that Saturday were awkward in a way that surprised me. Nate calling more than usual, almost performatively, as though frequency alone could undo 11 years of small dismissals. I told him, gently, that I didn't need more phone calls. I needed different ones. Slowly, over that spring, they got different. He started asking questions he'd never asked before. Not, "Can you help with this?" but, "How did you manage all this on a cafeteria salary?" Genuine curiosity instead of assumption. I told him about Priscilla, about the conservative little portfolio I'd built in total privacy for 9 years. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone. "You never told anybody that," he said. "Nobody ever asked what I did with my own money," I said. "Only what I could do with it for somebody else." By March, he'd started a modest, separate savings account of his own, not asking me to match it, not mentioning it to anyone else. Just something Colleen told me about later, almost shyly, like she was handing me a small gift she wasn't sure I'd want. In April, for Desmond's 6th birthday, Nate paid for the whole thing himself and made a point, quietly, of telling me so beforehand. not as a performance, just as information, the kind you'd naturally share with someone whose trust you were trying to rebuild. It wasn't all smooth. There was a Tuesday in May when Nate called frustrated about a permit issue on a landscaping contract, and halfway through venting, he said, almost automatically, "Anyway, I don't suppose you'd know anyone at the city who could," and then stopped himself so abruptly, I heard him exhale on the other end of the line. "Sorry," he said. "Old habit. I didn't mean it like that." I told him it was all right, that habits take longer to unlearn than intentions do, and that I'd rather he catch himself mid-sentence than never notice at all. We both sat with that for a second, and then he laughed, a little embarrassed, and asked about my tomatoes instead. Marisol and I never became close. I want to be honest about that too, since not every thread in a story like this gets neatly tied. She apologized once, in June, briefly and a little stiffly, for the comment about the green bean casserole all those years back, and I accepted it the way you accept an apology you weren't necessarily owed in that exact form, but are still glad to receive. We are cordial now. Cordial is not nothing. I've learned not to expect every relationship in a family to heal at the same speed or to the same depth, and I've made peace with the fact that some of them simply level off into something workable rather than something warm. Colleen, on the other hand, surprised me the most. She started calling on Sunday afternoons, just to talk, not about money, not about the kids, just about her week, my garden, a book she was reading. In August she asked, almost hesitantly, if I'd teach her Walt's chili recipe, the one I used to make every fall, and we spent an entire Saturday afternoon in my kitchen, flour on the counter, Pepper supervising from the windowsill, while she told me things about her own mother I don't think she'd ever told anyone in the family before. I understood, sitting there, that the silence I'd let fall that December hadn't just changed my relationship with Nate. It had made room for a dozen smaller, quieter repairs I hadn't even known were waiting to happen. I set one boundary that spring, and I held it, even when it was uncomfortable to do so. I told Nate and Colleen that I would no longer be the default source for financial gaps, not out of anger, but because I'd finally understood that my constant availability had let everyone, myself included, avoid harder, more honest conversations about money for over 2 decades. The first time Nate hit a rough patch after that, a slow month for the landscaping company in June, he called to vent, the way people do, and stopped himself halfway through. "I'm not asking you to fix it," he said. "I just wanted to tell someone." That sentence, more than almost anything else that whole year, told me something real had shifted. By September, Nate had started a habit of his own, one he never announced, the way I'd never announced mine. A standing coffee date, 7 o'clock on Sunday mornings, not evenings, at the Aurora line, just the two of us, before the rest of the day filled up with everyone else's needs. Fran started pouring his coffee before he sat down too, eventually, the same way she'd always done for me. Some Sundays we talked about nothing, the Vikings, the price of gas, whether Desmond should take trombone or trumpet. Other Sundays he'd bring up something harder, something from those 11 years, and turn it over out loud, slowly, the way you'd examine a stone you'd carried in your pocket so long you'd almost forgotten it was there. I never once brought the ledger back into those conversations. It had already done its work. What was left after that belonged to the two of us talking, not to any piece of paper. Juniper's question stayed with me the longest, honestly. Kids ask the truest questions precisely because they haven't learned yet which truths adults prefer left alone. I made a point, that summer, of taking her out on her own, just the two of us, ice cream at a little stand on the lakefront, and I told her, in terms an 11-year-old could actually hold on to, that I loved being her grandmother because of who she was, not because of anything I could buy her, and that if she ever again felt unsure whether she was loved for herself, she should ask, out loud, exactly the way she'd asked me at that dinner table. I told her that question hadn't hurt me the way she might have worried it did. It had helped me. She hugged me so hard my sunglasses fell off. She was quiet for a moment after that, licking her melting ice cream, and then she asked me something else, in the offhand way children ask the questions that matter most. "Are you and Dad okay now?" "We're getting there," I told her. "It's not the kind of thing that fixes itself in one conversation. It's more like, you know how the garden doesn't come back all at once in spring? First it's just the tips of things poking up, and you're not even sure yet if it's really coming back or if it's just the cold playing tricks on you. That's where your dad and I are. Tips of things poking up. She thought about that for a second, entirely serious, the way only an 11-year-old can be serious about a metaphor. So it's like a garden, but for feelings. That's about the size of it, I said, and she seemed satisfied enough with that to go back to her ice cream. And I remember thinking that if nothing else good came out of that whole difficult year, at least one child in my family now had language for what was happening around her instead of just absorbing it the way I'd absorbed things for so long without knowing what to call any of it. There was one more thing, small, but it undid something in me every time I thought about it afterward. My mixing bowl. A heavy cream-colored ceramic bowl that had belonged to my own mother, the one I'd used every single Christmas of my life to make her stuffing recipe. The one Nate had knocked off the counter and cracked clean through when he was 19, mortified, certain I'd be furious. I hadn't been. I just quietly put it away. That October, a box arrived on my porch. Inside was the bowl, my bowl, carefully repaired, the crack sealed with a fine gold seam along the break, kintsugi style, clearly done by someone who'd taken real time and care with it. A note in Nate's handwriting said only, "Found this in your garage when I was helping clear the gutters. Had it fixed instead of asking. Wanted you to have it back the way it should have been a long time ago. Christmas is on me this year, all of it. Love, Nate." I called him that evening, and for once I was the one who couldn't quite find the words right away. He waited me out, which was new for him. The old Nate would have filled the silence with reassurance or deflection, but this Nate just let it sit until I was ready. "I found somebody 2 towns over who does that gold seam repair work," he finally said, when I still hadn't managed a full sentence. Took him about 6 weeks. "I know it's just a bowl, Mom. I just wanted the crack to still be visible. Didn't want it looking like nothing ever happened to it. Felt like that would have missed the point." I told him it didn't miss the point at all. I told him it was, without question, the finest gift I had received in 22 years of Decembers, and I meant it with my whole chest. I used that bowl that December, gold seam and all, to make my mother's stuffing recipe at a dinner my son paid for entirely on his own, at 7 o'clock in the evening, though nobody planned that timing on purpose. It was just when dinner happened to be ready. Nobody mentioned the transfer that never came. Nobody needed to. The silence had already said everything it needed to say, months before, and what filled the space where it used to be was something neither of us had to force. If there's one thing I've come to believe, it's this. Love that only moves in one direction, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually stops being love and starts being a habit nobody examines. And the kindest thing you can sometimes do for the people you love most is to let a silence fall where a rescue used to be and trust them to grow into the space it leaves behind. Restraint was never my weakness in this story. It was the only thing strong enough to hold the truth still long enough for everyone, including me, to finally look at it. If this story landed somewhere true for you, if you've ever been the quiet one funding a family that never quite saw you, I'd love to hear it. Tell me in the comments what your own 7 o'clock was, and if you think anyone else needs to hear this one, go ahead and share it with them.